First, let us draw out our supply and demand curves so we know what we're working with. So let's do that first. We have our axes. On the y-axis, we have price level. On our x-axis, we have real GDP. Okay, and then we have our three curves. 1, 2, oops, let me redraw that one. Okay, so the vertical curve is our long-run aggregate supply curve. This upward sloping curve is our short-run aggregate supply curve. And this downward sloping curve is our aggregate demand. Okay, now we have our visual setup. Let us look at the question. Now, we are working with shifts of the curve. Now we have to figure out what curve is shifting. Is it the short run aggregate supply curve or the aggregate demand curve? Let us look at the question and look at the wording. So there's a firm which accounts for around a third of capital spending. Now, capital spending, that should ring a bell. Capital spending is part of aggregate demand because aggregate demand is equal to capital spending, which is part of investment. It is also comprised of consumption, government spending, and net exports. So capital spending, which is equal to investment, is part of aggregate demand. So we should right away be thinking we're working with the aggregate demand curve. Okay, so, and then the question continues to say that investments are expected to be slashed. So again, investment, which we just said, is part of aggregate demand. So given those two little hints, we know that we're working with a shift in the aggregate demand curve. If there's a slash or a decrease in investment spending, which is equal to capital spending, then that means the aggregate demand curve shifts leftward. So we are going to draw a leftward shift of our aggregate demand curve. Okay, and we're going to label it AD1. Okay, so I also want us to draw this out. So this is our initial price level and our initial real GDP, which would be a numeric value, but we don't have that right now, so we're just going to label it as such. Now, when the aggregate demand curve shifts leftwards, we have a new price level, which we will indicate as PL subscript 1, and we will have a new real GDP, indicated by our GDP 1. Okay, so we are asked to illustrate the situation, which we just did. And we see that there's a decrease in price level and a decrease in real GDP. And now we have to show the adjustment back to long-run equilibrium. So we are going to assume that there is no fiscal or monetary policy that is implemented to artificially push us back to real GDP. And we're going to assume that there was a natural return to real GDP. So a natural return would be a rightward shift, of that SRAS curve, or short run aggregate supply curve, which we're going to label as SRAS. I'm going to give it subscript 2, just so we don't mix up with these subscript 1s. So over here, we have a new even lower price level, which is PL2, and we are back to our initial real GDP there. Okay, so although Okay, so although that is the end of the question, I do want to highlight that there is an even lower price level when we return to real GDP as a result of the rightward shift of SRAS 2. But I want us to think of a real life example of how the SRAS curve might shift rightwards again. So if we had a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve, that means that there is lower demand. So it might take a really long time for this to happen, but after a certain amount of time, firms are going to start accepting a lower price. Workers are going to start accepting a lower wage. So all of that will allow the firms to increase their output and shift the SRAS curve rightwards again, leading us to the initial real GDP that we had before the start of the problem. So that is just an example of the factors that might shift the SRAS curve rightwards again. Okay, great. That is the end of my explanation.